for this session of the Bible study, we will be discussing chapters 4 and 5. I don't have to ask you guys if you read them because I'm 90% sure you already did. So, the reflection questions for chapter 4 is going to start on page 163 of your book. But I wanted to, before we dive into these reflection questions, I wanted to toss it to you guys to see what you thought of chapter 4 before I ended talking for way too long.
Well, I guess the thing that stuck out with, well, we read it with Cain, so we was thinking, well, we always thought we was the first people, you know, like Adam and Eve, when they said maybe there was people outside of the garden, you know, we was thinking that ain't true, because you've always thought, well, Adam and Eve was the first ones, but, you know, I guess as we read through it, you know, we kind of tried to make ourselves, you know, come to senses that maybe it was, but that was the one thing, I know right off the bat we were saying, well, Adam and Eve wasn't the first people, so.
And that kind of follow up on that point too. It's, you know, I think sort of odd, or, you know, like, why are we taught to believe that? Or maybe we're not taught to believe that and we just infer that. But it's almost like, well, if that's not the truth, then why are we supposed to believe it that way? Or I don't know, it just brings some questions, like, not sure the importance of us believing that they're the first people if they're not. Like, I don't know, it's just sort of weird to hear that. And like Richie said, not like, are you supposed to believe that or not? Or so.
Well, I guess the whole thing is it's the story of creation.
Right.
So you're thinking, oh, well, there's new birds and bees and plants and ocean and here's Adam. Well, Adam needs Eve. Well, you're thinking, well, they got to be the first two people. But then whenever it goes into explain, which really doesn't matter, but that's what stuck out to all of us with chapter 4.
Yeah. I think that gets us right into our first question, which talks about, it says, read Romans 5:12-20 and discuss how this passage affects your reading of the story. And just for simplicity, I'm going to put that specific passage in the chat, or I'm going to attempt to put it in the chat. What? I thought I would be all cool and nope, it's not gonna let me. So if you have your phone or Bible, I mean, who knew we were gonna actually use a Bible as when talking about Genesis? I shouldn't.
You got
But
it right, Romans.
It's Romans 5, starting in verse 12.
Well, that's 2, 4, 6, 8, 9, 11, 8, 20.
Romans
You want one of us to read it?
Yeah, that would be great.
Well, one of y'all get to it. You got it pulled up.
When Adam sinned, sin entered the world. Adam's sin brought death, so death spread to everyone, for everyone sinned. Yes, people sinned even before the law was given, but it was not counted as sin because there was not yet any law to break. Still, everyone died from the time of Adam to the time of Moses, even those who did not disobey an explicit commandment of God as Adam did. Now Adam is a symbol, a representation of Christ who was yet to come. But there's a great difference between Adam's sin and God's gracious gift. For the sin of this one man, Adam, brought death to many. But even greater is God's wonderful grace and his gift of forgiveness to many through this other man, Jesus Christ. And the result of God's gracious gift is very different from the result of that one man's sin. For Adam's sin led to condemnation, but God's free gift leads to our being made right with God, even though we are guilty of many sins. For the sin of this one man, Adam, caused death to rule over many. But even greater is God's wonderful grace and his gift of righteousness. For all who receive it will live in triumph over sin and death through this one man, Jesus Christ. Yes, Adam's one sin brings condemnation for everyone, but Christ's one act of righteousness brings a right relationship with God and new life for everyone. Because one person disobeyed God, many become sinners. But because one other person obeyed God, many will be made righteous. God's law was given so that all people could see how sinful they were. But as people sinned more and more, God's wonderful grace became more abundant. So just
That's good there. You read through verse 20, correct?
Right.
Okay. Yeah, that's good there. So in this Romans passage, Paul is kind of comparing Adam with Christ, and he's saying, so Adam, this one man, has sinned, but Christ almost like restores it. So the implications of Adam's sin kind of, as far as Paul's understanding, the implication of Adam's sin is because Adam was the first man. This sin goes on to all of humanity. And we as Christians, we as the Western Church often use Paul's account in Romans chapter 5 to interpret the Genesis account, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just important to know that in Romans, Paul is interpreting the creation story. And he's interpreting the creation story in a way that would point to Christ, in a way to preach the gospel and show what has been accomplished with Christ. But the actual thing of Adam ate from the tree and therefore sin entered in the world, that whole concept is not explicitly spelled out in the text of Genesis 3. Rather, it's an interpretation of our early church fathers. Did I explain that well? Any thoughts on that?
I guess it would just be, confusing unless you know this piece of information. I don't know. I guess I struggle with, why is it not just spelled out the way it really happened? Like, it's almost like you were told, like believe in Santa Claus all your life, and then you reach a certain age, and then you're told, well, he's not real. So it's almost like one of those things where, like, I see the point and how and why it was told that way, but it almost makes it more confusing, I think, to try to figure out then what other things are, different or not black and white. Is there a hidden meaning in something else, or is it important? Maybe we're supposed to just believe in that, and then one day it'll be revealed to us when we get to heaven. Or I guess that would be my question. I don't know.
Well, I guess like we read too, it said that them eating from the tree of knowledge wasn't bad in a sense, but they weren't ready to gain that knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah.
So I guess, you might want to know something now, but if it's not meant for you to know now, then it's better for it to come in time.
Yeah, I think that plays in with the third question about the difference between the church in the West interpretation of Adam and Eve and the Eastern church's interpretation, where in the West, the mantra was, okay, they ate the fruit, then sin entered in the world. Rather, the interpretation from the East they mentioned in the book is what happened was they had the knowledge of good and evil before they came to maturity for it. And I kind of like that talk about sin a lot better, or not about sin, but about the story of Adam and Eve. Because the whole point of the law, that like Leviticus, Deuteronomy, is showing the people the knowledge of good and evil. It wouldn't make sense that God did not want to show Adam and Eve the knowledge of good and evil in the garden, but then he can't stop but show them the knowledge of good and evil when the law is given on Mount Sinai. So,
Well, and that's another thing that we brought up too with Catherine was, it says, was it an original sin or like a loss of innocence? Well, I don't know if they technically had like a broken lost sin, because the commandments wasn't even wrote at that time.
Right. So how
So
could
we
it
was
be?
thinking, well, it might be a sin, but it's
If he saw a
innocence
bug
lost
in the
too.
garden and stopped on it,
Then
well,
he's killing something.
right, is
but
that
it
more
might
of a sin than
biting fruit.
right?
I like how you mentioned that, well, the commandments weren't even written. How
Right.
do they know it was a sin? And we might be getting into chapter 5 or something. Chapters are kind of arbitrary as they presented before. But looking at Adam and Eve, in Genesis chapter 2 is a prototype of Israel, is a miniature Israel. Like in chapter 5, it talked about Cain sacrificed to the Lord. Well, how does Cain know what to sacrifice when Leviticus wasn't given? But looking at Adam and Eve and Cain as a miniature Israel helps us see why that happened. Plus, one insight that I kind of had is the power of storytelling. My mind went to in the book of Samuel, David sleeps with Bathsheba and has a child, and then has Uriah killed on the battle line. Are you guys familiar with that story?
Yeah, right.
And then, cool. And then Nathan, the prophet, confronts David with this story of of this poor man and a rich man, and the rich man basically stole all that the poor man had, and David has this righteous anger of the rich man should face punishment. And then Nathan came in and said, David, you are that rich man. You took the only wife that Uriah had, where you had all the wealth in the kingdom. You could have had everything that you wanted, but yet you had to take his. And how that plays into this Genesis story is, I think it's easier almost to learn from a story, learn from somebody else's mistakes, rather than learning from our own mistakes. So in reading the story of Adam and Eve, I could be like, haha, Adam and Eve, they're so stupid. Why did they have to eat the apple? Why did they have to disobey God? It's right in front of them, until I see, oh wait, they're me. I do that. And see myself in this story, rather than someone coming to me and saying, no, you're so stupid. Why can't you see this? You know, having that story allows me to see that revelation for myself. So going off of that, and some of what we talked about last week, these stories don't have to necessarily be historically accurate. If we're wanting them to be historically accurate, we're missing the point of what great storytellers do. And I personally think part of the art of the Bible is it is an awesome story that is crafted in such a way that it's applicable to generations to come, and we're reading it right now. So I'll get off my soapbox and let you guys talk.
Well, I think that was a good way of looking, because don't line for line, word for word. Just stop, listen, and I guess get the entire picture before you get to the nitty gritty, because some of the times you just, like you said, it's not important as everything is 100%.
Yeah. And it's hard to admit that if I grew up in a church where it's like, the Bible is true. You need to believe in the Bible, and the Bible will never leave you astray. And in recent years, I'm like, I still believe the Bible is true. But then the question for me comes to, what does true mean when labeling the Bible? And is true even a good adjective? Because does the Bible is true mean the Bible is historically accurate? Because I don't know if it is historically accurate based on modern biblical scholarship. But I do believe that God speaks through his word. And for me, that means the Bible is true, that it is something of spiritual growth. So, yeah. I don't know where I was going with that.
I think that, you know, honestly, I think just tagging on to that, I think that's the thing that I think truth is, you know, it depends on your definition of truth. But, you know, like you said, I really think that the Bible is everything, Scripture is everything that we need to know to have a relationship with God through his son, Jesus Christ. And I think that's the thing, that the more that you study from a scholarly level and know and read other scholars' readings and understandings, and once you know the languages that it was written in and the style of writing and the events of the times and stuff, you know, I think some stories in them are stories of things that really happened. And I also think there's stories in there that are stories to teach a point or a lesson or to tell things. And so, you know, it's kind of, and there's poetry in there, and there's other, you know, there's so many other things that speak to us about who God is. And so it really is a collection of books and stories of how humanity has understood who our creator was over time, and the interaction people had and viewed God in those interactions over time. So and knowing that, then that guides us to where we are today, walking by faith.
I like that. I'm reminded of something that I don't know where I heard it, but in the Gospels you have Jesus flat out saying, or in the Gospels the writers usually introduce one of Jesus's parables with, and Jesus told a parable saying, like, there was a rich man who blah 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 blah. But that's not really done in the Old Testament. Rather, the point this person was trying to make was, in Genesis, the writer made stuff so outlandish, like having a talking snake and fruit that represented good and evil, using all of this parabolic language without flat out saying this is a parable. But those things, like the talking snake, the fruit that was representing good and evil, all hints in saying, hey, this is a parable. This probably didn't happen. But, you know, it like invests us in this story, because I know, at least for me, when the gospel writers are saying, and Jesus tells a parable, that kind of shifts the focus from what's actually happening in the narrative to the parable. And then after the parable is told, you shift back into the narrative. But in Genesis, there's no kind of shift. It's a consistent story that at some point shifts into history, depending on when you believe like Israelite history began, which is a whole nother topic entirely of like, how did the Israelites become a nation? How did they get to the promised land? All that stuff, but which we might discuss in later chapters, but that's more Exodus, because we have to remember Exodus is a continuation of Genesis. There's not that hard split.
Right.
So I guess continuing off of that, I'll ask this question. Does recognizing that people lived outside of the Garden of Eden, like you mentioned, while the story of Adam and Eve is happening inside of the Garden of Eden, affect your view on these types of origins?
Yeah, it makes me wonder, well, where did they come from? So
Right.
it's kind of a big cycle, you know. I guess you can get caught up in, you know, the scientific or the historical, you know, accuracy, or if you just say, well, I guess it's not important, and this is where we're supposed to start knowing is Adam and Eve. That's the first people, I guess, of real importance. Is that, I guess, what we're supposed to take from it? And the people that lived millions of years before them, I guess, were not important to the story, so we're not supposed to know about them, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. It's a little confusing because we were always taught that,
Right.
you know, Adam and Eve was like, Adam was made, then the rib was taken out, and then Eve, and they were like number one and number two. Now all of a sudden, oh man, no, hey, there's a bunch of people out there. It's like, where did they come from? You know? So, yeah, it's kind of different way to think about it, you know?
I
But
think
then
that's the hard thing.
maybe we got to think of it like last week. We're going to Chick-fil-A. We want the sandwich. We don't care how it got there.
Right.
So they're telling us Adam and Eve's there, and there might be other people outside, but it really don't matter because you're supposed to focus on Adam and Eve. So
Right.
we want the sandwich and the fries and the smoothie. We don't care how the chicken was killed and battered up.
Yeah,
Give us
that's right. That's right. Where were the potatoes from? Idaho? I don't care. I just want the waffle fries.
But we do know how to make them, don't we?
I have to say that it makes me think about the fillets I get from that meat market down the road too. But you know, I don't care how they get there, but they sure are good when they go on my grill. But
There you go.
I think that's the challenge that I've always had with Genesis and understanding the beginning of Genesis as story, as myth, as humanity's way of explaining how God created and where people came from, I think has been helpful to me because, you know, I do believe God's hand is in science as well. And so I know there are people that believe the earth is only, you know, about 3,000 or 4,000 years old because that's how far back you can date it based on Bible stories. You know, if you take all the lineage of all the people and date it back, it's like, okay, the earth started 5,000 years ago, but yet, you know, we've got science that says it's, you know, thousands, hundreds of thousands of years old, you know, whatever. And so I think that for me, understanding Adam and Eve is more of story of man's understanding at the time when they didn't understand science and stuff is easier than, because my question has always been, where did the other people come from? When they started having, you know, people for Cain and Abel to marry and stuff, where did the people come from? You know, there's people that weren't there. So, you know, there's always been that idea that there are other people out there, but like you said, where do they come from? Who are they? You know, they just, okay, so Adam and Eve were made first, and then these other people just appeared after they like left the garden. So I think that's the hard part with Bible, is that there are gaps. There, where are the dinosaurs? I don't see the dinosaurs. And those are those are another fun class to ask. Where are these other things that aren't in Bible, and how do you explain those in faith? And some people, I've known people that had very strong faith that said, well, they're not real. Dinosaurs aren't real. They never existed because it's not in Bible. And then others that explained it, those are things that happen in creation that, between, the 7 days of creation weren't just 7 days. They were actually longer than our days. And so it's like, are 7 days of creation really 24-hour days, or are they a period of time? And so I think there's a lot of questions in the Bible. And those are the things, I think the thing that we have to trust is that the stories help shape our lives. The stories help us understand who God is. And when we get to heaven, we say, hey, God, okay, I need to know about this. I mean, why wasn't this explained? Or in some of the stories, there's a lot of violence, and, out of vengeance, we can take all their daughters for our wives, and, take all their cattle for ours, or they slaughter them, or, it's just like, oh my goodness. And God not only allowed this, but God made it happen and blessed it. I can't even imagine, So I think there's just so many things that help us understand God, understand humanity at that time, and helps us build our faith from those places and those stories, but still not having all the answers. It's not said, okay, you need to believe this first, and then this, and then this. That's not how the stories are written. So,
Yeah.
Well, and that makes sense too, because we also brought up, if these people lived 900 and something years old. Well, buddy, we're being shafted a lot right. So it's probably like Mike said, their 7 days might have been years, but what's their year? Is it 2 weeks or 10 days, or you don't never know? So,
well, I think Mary Alice is pretty old. I mean, she might be close to that age, but 907.
I'm sure she is.
Jade.
I'm just kidding. I love Mary Alice, but she knows everything about everything around here, so she has to have been around forever.
Yeah, there's a few more we can't mention.
Right?
We always say, there's those people
That
when
grow up.
we were little, as far back as you can remember, that were old then. And it's like today they haven't changed. You can look at them and think, I'm 30 years old now, and that woman was old when I was little.
When I turn 30, I hope I can have those kinds of memories too.
Well, hopefully you can.
Wait, when?
Right. When I turn, hush, Noah, when I turn 30.
There you go.
Keep them honest, Noah.
Or 50. Yeah, that's close.
One idea that I had for this question was that if we continue to look at Adam and Eve as a miniature Israel, the garden is representing like God's protection. In the Old Testament, you'll notice vaguely when Israel is following God's law, which does not happen much, everything's going well. But when they abandon God and go worship idols, God's protection almost is not there. And we see that God's protection is not there by them being conquered by other nations. For a simplistic sense of it. So I think this story is a powerful one of saying, like, of reminding the people of Israel to follow the law, and with the law comes flourishing and protection in the land that God's called them to. That was at least my idea of like incorporating some of the themes that were presented in the book. Awesome. Are you guys ready to move on to chapter 5?
Yes.
I would say so.
Awesome. We kind of covered a lot of chapter 5 and chapter 4. But it says, the first question says, so I'll need another reader because it says, read Proverbs 1. What connections do you see with Cain's story in Genesis 4? How do you explain these connections, and what do you think it meant for how the Bible came together? And my reader can read Proverbs 1, starting in verse 1, going through verse 7.
Well, I'll read it. These are the Proverbs of Solomon, David's son, king of Israel. Their purpose is to teach people wisdom and discipline to help them understand the insights of the wise. Their purpose is to teach people to live disciplined and successful lives to help them to do what is right, just, and fair. These proverbs will give insight to the simple, knowledge and discernment to the young. Let the wise listen to these proverbs and become even wiser. Let those with understanding receive guidance by exploring the meaning in these proverbs and parables, the words of the wise and their riddles. Fear of the Lord is the foundation of true knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline.
Okay. Thank you for reading. So how does what connections can you see between this proverb and kind of how the Bible came together?
Well, I guess it began with back to Adam and Eve with the knowledge of good and evil. Because with the more proverbs and insights, it's giving you the knowledge and to become more wiser and understand.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's I just love the wisdom literature, which is made up of Psalms, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. And focusing on the book of Proverbs itself, that book we think came to be for training young men who would eventually become kings. But since then, it got put into our canon and applicable for all of us. And within that proverb, we have this common refrain, a repeated phrase, says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And I find that interesting because within Genesis, the tree represented the knowledge of good and evil. But for this writer of the Proverbs, it's no longer a tree that represents this knowledge. It is the fear of the Lord. And the book of Proverbs has the goal of teaching people this fear of the Lord. And I like this quote from the book. It says on page 63 through 64, you guys don't have to turn to it if you don't want to. It says, to be wise by following God's commandments, you get life. Or to be foolish by rejecting God's commands, you get death. Failure to follow wisdom has lethal consequences, not only privately, but socially. And I would say these lethal consequences are experienced by a failure to adhere to God's wisdom, which is a lack of fear of the Lord. I had a tough time on this question, to be honest. I'm like, what? So, yeah. What do you guys think of, I guess, the fear of the Lord and connection with wisdom?
Well, I think with the wisdom, I don't think you need to, I just don't think you need to fear it. I don't think you need to fear the Lord because he's given you the wisdom. So I don't know, you have the wisdom, so why are you fearing him? Unless you decide to go another direction that you're not using the wisdom. So I think, I just think that if you use the wisdom that you're getting, the fear does not need to be there.
Well, within the Proverbs, fear of the Lord, at least the way I learned it, was fear of the Lord isn't necessarily like being afraid of the Lord. Fear of the Lord is more having reverence, having respect for what the Lord is, and the impact that he has on our lives. Like, it's kind of like a child, a young child respecting their parents, following their parents' instructions. Now, they may or may not fear their parents and be like, oh, I'm afraid if I get a B on a test, what they'll do to me. But they have this reverence. And I guess verse 7, maybe it might sound a little better if it's the reverence / respect for the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. And with this verse, we have some parallelism. The two lines are like antithetical or opposite to one another. Those who follow, those who have fear get knowledge, but those who despise this fear, lack wisdom, and lack instruction. So, yeah. Any responses before we move on to our last question of the night?
Well, I guess that makes sense. You don't, I guess the fear would be, I guess you know what you should and should not do. So if you don't do it, then you have a fear of some sort of bad outcome. So I guess that's how I look at it is, you know what you should do. So if you
That's right.
do the opposite or whatever, then something's coming after.
There's some kind of repercussions if you're not doing it right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
So what's the last? Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I guess in connection with Cain and Abel, in the book, they talked about how one of their sacrifices God accepted, and the other sacrifice was not the first fruits, and God did not accept that sacrifice. And it's showing that the one that didn't give the first fruits did not have a proper fear of the Lord. I always get them confused. Which one did God accept their sacrifice?
Oh.
Do you guys remember? Was it Cain or Abel?
I don't remember.
I think God accepted the sacrifice from Abel.
From Abel.
That's what I'm thinking.
Okay.
Because that's why Cain, that's part of why Cain got mad.
Okay, yeah. So
Cain was a bad dude, man. Yeah.
So Abel's one was from the first fruits.
Yeah.
Cain's was not.
Right. That's what I'm pretty sure that's right.
Well, and I guess that's another thing we can look at now and think, well, I guess I don't really look at it as like a sacrifice. Here, I'm going to kill my best lamb, goat, whatever. I guess as long as you're honoring him first, is how they wanted you to look at it, not, because with that story, one give like the second or whatever, wheat or berries or whatever. So I guess you want to make sure you give your best first. Don't say, oh, well, maybe another day or.
Yeah, that's a great modern interpretation, because even with me being in school, so often it's like, God, I'm so tired. I guess I should go to church. I guess I should read my Bible. I guess I should do all these things for you in the little extra time that I have, rather than thinking it all belongs to him. So I want to give God the best of what I have, whatever it may be, and not just the leftovers of what I have.
Mm-hmm. Right.
All right, we already talked about where sin came from, kind of, so I'm gonna skip that question. I'm gonna go it's going to be question 3 on chapter 5. I'll read it out loud. It says, we mentioned the Sumerian king list, an ancient document from one of Israel's neighbors that says kings lived thousands of years. Do you think the ages in Genesis 5 in reflection of this list are meant to be actual spans, or to make a statement about life before and after the flood? Why?
Yeah, no, it can be true lifespans because just we know better.
Yeah.
I mean, we just know better. Scientifically, we know better. You cannot live that long.
I mean, I could get up to the Earth is a few billion years old, probably, if I followed the Sumerian list rather than the biblical one. Yeah, I feel like that was it's a pretty simple question from what we've already talked about. I like how they mentioned in the book that because as we're discovering the next reading, other cultures had a flood event, not just the Bible's biblical one. Like other cultures had a creation event, like we talked about last week. And I like how they talked about how after the flood, God limited the age of humanity, and the Sumerian list reflects that, showing that within this one event, something cataclysmic happened. Change of everything. But yeah.
Well, and maybe, it might be asking in a way they might have had, an effect on the generations for thousands of years after. Maybe something they did or built or maybe something like that maybe affected for thousands after. But we all know they didn't live.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe if a well was dug or it supplied the city for 1,000 years, or maybe whatever they might have done might have impacted their life. But
I find it funny that for the people who lived like hundreds of years in the Bible, they lived this like 1,000 years, but yet they're mentioned maybe once in a genealogy, showing like, okay, even if they lived this long, they obviously were not that important.
Right.
Like, Jesus lived 33, and he has an entire testament written about him.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I just wonder how, like say Egyptians built them pyramids. I couldn't imagine hauling them brick. That kind of
stuff.
Carving out stuff. They can't even do it now with a backhoe or a bobcat, or I don't know how they did it back then with a bone pick.
Yeah, really. And that's true. Yeah.
I mean, I went to Israel and we were at Caesarea, and one of the stories we heard was, so King Herod got whatever he wanted. He would make these ridiculous demands, and people met him, or else he would die. So he said, I want a palace on the sea. So they built this palace by floating out this special material that would sink and actually raise the ground of the sea so they could build on it in the first century. And I'm like,
Good.
goodness,
Wow.
how did they think about this?
Yeah.
So even the pyramids, like that size of structure would take a massive undertaking even for today. And they did it thousands of years ago, which is just amazing.
Well, and it's still
I
standing.
know, it's still here today.
You'd think
Well,
it would
it
fall
did.
over the first wind come through, but it didn't. I know anything I build would float down. Or maybe my uncle, if you know who we're talking about.
Well, I'm gonna end the actual recording. This was going over chapters 4 through 5 of Genesis for normal people. And next week we will discuss chapters 6 through 7